Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to see everybody here. This is the last event of the year for the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies. This is our fifth year of the Institute, and we've been able to put together a number of events, lecture series, and cultural events, and panels and discussions all around the Eastern Mediterranean as we're sort of like trying to recast a region that has been sort of like defined over the last over 100 years, and our historians on the panel probably know much more than myself. Um, but a region that's sort of like been cast from political perspectives, whether that political perspective happens to be London or that political perspective happens to be um, Washington, whether it's the Near East, or the Middle East. And we've tried diligently the last 5 years to sort of like, redefine the region, sort of like the Eastern Mediterranean. And it's a region that's been defined over the last 100 years by the end of an empire that was around for centuries, an empire that had succeeded other empires and political structures in the region, but it's the most proximate to us historically. Of course, I'm speaking of the Ottoman Empire. And today, we're just sort of like, coming together and defining the region. And it's this year we're celebrating or commemorating the anniversary of a treaty that the Treaty of Lausanne defined the region for the last 100 years. It's a treaty that's sort of like has surfaced again as different states have all kinds of different ambitions, primarily the successor state of the Ottoman Empire, that of Turkey. So I am very pleased to conclude our fifth year of events with sort of like a panel that will sort of ask us the region historically, primarily. We have two historians on the panel, and we have a professor of journalism on the panel, three people that I respect highly, colleagues and people that I've read. And once you read someone, you think you know them even more so than when you meet them in person. So I had met Ureneck sometime, I had read his work. And so it's the first time that I meet him face to face in a panel like this. So I'm honored that he's here. And of course, our very own Melanie Murphy, associate professor in the Department of History, and she's done a great deal of work on looking at the relationship between culture and politics. And her latest work is a chapter in this book on Mein Kampf and the Holocaust, a prelude to genocide. And the title of her presentation or her input in the book is Marxism, Enemy of the People in the Political Party and Military System. And of course, a very dear friend of the Institute, and somebody that has come back, and I like to call a friend as well, Eric Goldstein, who's Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History. And although he gave me a very brief sort of like bio to read, I think it would take us more than the time that we have this afternoon to go over the things that Eric has done. He was previously a professor in the Center for Byzantine, Ottoman, and Modern Greek Studies at the University of Birmingham. He has written widely on international relations of the interwar period. He's always working on a project. I think he's working on a project on Lausanne, so maybe he'll give us some insight and information. And of course, we have with us Ureneck. He's a visiting fellow. He's a retired professor of journalism from Boston University. He's a visiting fellow of the Institute of Hellenic Culture and Liberal Arts at the American College of Greece in Athens. He has taught a variety of courses, including business, economics, and journalism. He has written 3 or 4 books, Lou, or four books. He has taught in professional settings as a writing coach for media and research organizations. His work has appeared in numerous newspapers and articles. He's a regular blogger for the Times. And, he's somebody that's well respected on this topic and on the subject. Of course, his great book, The Great Fire, speaking of the situation in Smyrna in 1922. We had an order on the panel on how the panelists were going to go, and of course the panelists have a mind of their own, so they changed the order. So we're going to have Professor Melanie Murphy first, and she's going to talk about deportations and Lausanne, and it's going to be followed by Professor Goldstein, who's going to talk about the legacy of Smyrna, the origins of international refugee assistance. And Professor Ureneck is going to capture this with a presentation on winning the war and losing the peace. Each presenter is going to present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A on this. We're a little bit challenged right now. We're trying to put this up. So we'll start out with Professor Murphy. Did I?
I don't know. Oh, wait, I know what we have to
Are
do.
you on?
I know what we have to do.
Next we will hear from Professor Ureneck, "Winning the War, Losing the Peace." I will read a quote before, just 1 second. It's from Mustafa Kemal in 1927. And he said, "Gentlemen, I don't think it's necessary any further to compare the principles underlying the Lausanne Peace Treaty with other proposals for peace. This treaty is a document declaring that all efforts prepared over centuries and thought to have been accomplished through the Sevres Treaty to crush the Turkish nation have been in vain. It is a diplomatic victory unheard of in the Ottoman history." This comes from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Turkey. This is the quote that they have there, and I think how significant it is politically. So, Lou, floor is yours.
Peter, thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for coming here. My expertise really is the city of Smyrna, which was destroyed in the violence that occurred during the Greek-Turkish War and is part of the events you're hearing about. And I'll say a few words about Smyrna in the course of my presentation, but really I'm going to try to address the topic that Peter gave us, which is the Lausanne Treaty. And I picked as my title for this, "Winning the War and Losing the Peace." Another title might be "Nothing Succeeds Like Success." So let me just try to give you a broad outline of some of the events that occurred in this period. I'm guessing that many of you are students and maybe you're coming to this for the first time, and it's a really complicated topic and area. So I'm going to just sort of straighten it out a little bit in terms of helping you understand some of the other things that I want to say. So between the fall of 1918, in the fall of 1918, the Allies and the United States defeated the Central Powers in the Great War. Between the fall of 1918 and the fall of 1922, the fall of 1922 is when the Turks prevailed in their war with Greece. In that 4-year period, we see one of the most amazing turnabouts in the history of war and peace. It's breathtaking if you could step back and consider what happened. So just quickly, again, I'm going to hit some high points here and then describe in a bit more detail what happened. As you all know, Turkey, which I'm using synonymously with the Ottoman Empire, Turkey was an ally of Germany in World War I. It was a part of the Central Powers, okay? The war was fought basically in 3 theaters: in the West, in Central Europe, and what was called then the Near East, okay? And by 1918, it was clear that the Germans, the Central Powers, led by Germany, was going to lose the war. General Allenby for the British was coming up through Egypt and Palestine into Syria, and the British took Baghdad. As a consequence of all of that, as part of World War I, the Ottoman forces, the Turkish forces, which were fighting principally in this area, were defeated. They were exhausted, basically devastated. There wasn't much left. It was time, the war was over basically for the Ottoman Empire. At about the same time, over a series of weeks, it became clear in other parts, in the Central Theater and in the Western Theater, that the Central Powers couldn't win the war. There was a very important breakthrough in Central Europe. The Allies broke through the Bulgarian front, and then there was, German defeats in the West as well. So all of this added up to essentially the defeat of the Central Powers. Not essentially, it was the defeat of the Central Powers in the Great War. And there was a series of armistices. These are sort of like ceasefires with certain treaty elements attached to them in each part of the theaters. And one of these was signed between the Allies and Turkey in October of 1918. And it basically, and this is really important, the armistice between the defeated Ottoman Empire and the Allies, as captured, in the language of this treaty, of this armistice, it allowed the Allies to basically occupy Turkey. They were going to occupy the military fortifications. They would eventually occupy Constantinople. They took over the empire's finances. They were in charge. They were the winners, and the losers, the Turks, were going to have to submit to their terms. Okay, so that's 1918. We have a situation where the Allies are preeminent. They're victors in the war. Turkey and its allies, Germany, Bulgaria, Austria-Hungary, and so forth, are defeated. So what happens 2 years later, okay, 1918, 1920, we have something called the Treaty of Sèvres. Okay, this was a treaty that was formulated between the Allies and the Turks, that laid out the terms of the peace, so-called, that was going to happen in the East. You've heard of the Treaty of Versailles. This was supposed to be the parallel treaty for the Turks. And it was a treaty, the Sèvres Treaty, that basically dismembered Turkey. It took it apart. And it assigned certain parts of the Ottoman Empire to the French, to the Italians, to the British. It took property, Thrace, possessions that Turkey had, gave them to the Greeks. And so it was, it was really tough. It was a very tough treaty on the Turks. And by then, of course, the Allies were already occupying Constantinople. So you get the picture. We have a defeated empire, the Ottoman Empire, and these allies who were forcing their terms on them. Okay, so that's 1920. Now in 1922, okay, yet 2 more years later, what do we see? We see something, the absolute reversal of all of this. There's a new armistice now called the Armistice at Medania. And this sets up the negotiations that will happen at Lausanne, right? And so what happens at Lausanne? What we see, what happens at Medania, we see now that the Turks have the upper hand, okay? And they're, in a sense, dictating to the Allies. I'm taking a little bit of liberty here, but they're essentially dictating to the Allies the terms of the peace. Now, this is quite incredible. And I wrote a book about Smyrna, and it deals peripherally with some of these issues. And I just want to read you 2 sentences that I think sort of capture what's happening here. It was as if a German general had rejected Berlin's acceptance of the Treaty of Versailles. You're all familiar with the Treaty of Versailles and what happened, okay? It was as if a German general had rejected Berlin's acceptance of the Treaty of Versailles, formed a populist army in Bavaria, and marched against French forces occupying the Rhineland. It was an astonishing turn of events brought about by the failure of France, Britain, to back the Sèvres Treaty, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we've got this incredible turnabout. What happened? What caused this? What set up this change? How did the Allies go from victors to being, in a sense, almost supplicants to the Turks? Well, several things happened. First, there was British fatigue. The British economy was a disaster at this point. Britain was tired from the war. It had lost many, many men. It had spent lots of money, and it was not eager to enforce the terms of the Sèvres Treaty. Okay, even those were strict terms, but they weren't getting enforced. So that was one important element. Another important element was American apathy and isolationism. America obviously was in World War I. It played an important part in a lot of the discussions leading up to these treaties and so forth. But by 1922, the Americans had lost interest in the entire subject. President Wilson, who had been deeply involved in Versailles, brought back a treaty that included the League of Nations. The Senate rejected it. And the Americans were ready to move on. They had elected a new president, Warren Harding, and they didn't want any of this. So the Americans sort of stepped back and didn't want to get involved. And the events unfolded in the ways that I'm describing. And then thirdly, the Allies were fighting among themselves. And this had been going on for a very long time. Britain had war aims, France had war aims, Italy had war aims, and they didn't all line up. And they were sort of intriguing and working against each other, sort of behind the scenes. But perhaps the most important element in this turnabout was the emergence of something called the Turkish nationalist movement. So, what was that? At this time, there emerged a leader. He had been a successful military leader in the Ottoman army, in the defeated Ottoman army. And he was saddened by the loss of what had happened in World War I. And he was extremely patriotic, and he wanted to revive Turkey for the Turks. His name was Mustafa Kemal. Many of you may know him by the name Ataturk, okay? So Mustafa Kemal put together an army and a movement that challenged the Ottoman government in Constantinople, and also sought to drive the Allies completely out of Turkey, out of the Ottoman Empire. As all of this was occurring, telling you it was complicated, as all of this was occurring, Greece had landed in Smyrna, a city in Turkey, in order to protect the Christian population and also to claim some of these lands as their own. The Greeks and the Turks had been ancient enemies, and Mustafa Kemal was able to use the Greek landing at Smyrna as a way to sort of fire up the Turkish population, to raise an army, and the Greeks principally became kind of the face of the Allies in Anatolia. There was a war. The Greeks lost the war. They were pushed out of Asia Minor. They exited through Smyrna. The city of Smyrna was burned. And that was in September of 1922. Okay, so what we have in September of 1922, as opposed to, back in October of 1918, 4 years later, is a situation where now the Turks have the upper hand. Okay, and the Turks are actually ready to go to war with Britain. And there was some talk in Britain of going back to war with Turkey. That talk didn't last very long, and it eventually led to the fall of the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, in London. But it's in this context that you need to understand what happened in the treaty that followed, okay, in the Treaty of Lausanne. So the Turks go to Lausanne, and by the way, the Americans were represented there, but they really weren't part of the negotiations. They were there to watch out for their own commercial interests. That's a side story. The Turks were really negotiating with the British, the French, and the Italians. And they basically got what they wanted. They got back land that they had given to Greece, Thrace, and they were back, and their sovereignty had returned and so forth. So they were very successful in doing something that has become a kind of landmark in a way. I mean, it's an astonishing thing that happened there in these peace negotiations. And I know that I'm looking at the audience, and I'm looking at Peter, and I know there's probably a great deal of Greek interest here in this subject. I'm sort of guessing, right? Now, for the Allies, this was a loss of sorts, but for the Greeks, it was a disaster. I mean, it was an the catastrophe, the Greeks call it, right? It was an unmitigated disaster. Why? Why was it such a big disaster? And Eric is going to talk a lot more about this and with a lot more authority than I can. But the Greeks had been living in Anatolia for thousands of years, right? Something like 20% of the population of Asia Minor was Christian, Greek and Armenian, and to some extent Assyrian, right? And so the events that occurred following Kemal's rise, let's say in 1919 through to 1922, ended with the expulsion of the Greeks, the Christians really, from Anatolia. Tremendous refugee crisis, loss of property and so forth, as well as tremendous amount of death and destruction. You know, all through this period, actually beginning in 1912, going up to 1922, the Turks in two successive governments had run a genocide. They killed, 1.5 to 2 million people, okay? And so these events are crucial in terms of world history. Out of it came the Republic of Turkey, eventually an ally of the United States, so that took a long time. And it changed the nature of Greece dramatically. 25% of the population of Greece, the population of Greece increased by 25% as a consequence of the refugees and so forth. And so what we see is a change in the world order with the emergence of the Republic, the Turkish Republic, but an enormous change for the nation of Greece. A credible amount of suffering that followed. So the significance, of Lausanne is hard to overstate, and it's really interesting for those of you who study war and peace. And it's a demonstration of how winning a war is only the beginning of bringing together a successful peace.
The parallels are tremendous, even in the most recent past. Whether we talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, I think there are echoes of that. Our next presenter, of course, is Professor Goldstein, The Legacy of Smyrna, The Origins of International Refugee Assistance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to look at some of the longer term consequences of what was happening in Lausanne. I'm going to focus on the refugee issue. I remember as a student wondering what I was going to do after I graduated, and one of the career advisors said, you might want to think about working with refugees. You'll never be unemployed. So I pass on that advice because it turned out it was probably true. You never will be in the way that international politics have been developing. I'm going to try to connect in looking at some of the events that follow from the First World War that Lausanne's the pivot moment of. We'll connect Greece, Armenia, Turkey, as we've been hearing about, and as the extra factor for you, the one you might not have thought about, Norway in all of this, because it comes into the story. So as we were hearing, in November 1922, the great powers that had been victorious in the war convened a conference, the Lausanne Conference, that took until the spring of the following year to reach its conclusion, the event we're commemorating this evening, where they rewrote the post-war peace settlement with Turkey and needed to resolve some of the issues of the very recent war between Greece and Turkey that had culminated in the burning of Smyrna that Professor Ureneck just mentioned, the event that's gone down in Greek history simply as the catastrophe, katastrophia. And what involved that I'm going to focus on is what do you do with the remaining Hellenic population of Anatolia, whose existence, if they were to continue in Anatolia, was tenuous at best. So one of the things diplomats have to do in negotiations is to try to find solutions. Diplomacy is ever inventive. It's always looking for new ways to deal with things. And in this instance, the negotiators at Lausanne came up with a solution, what they refer to as the exchange of populations. It sounds like a nice, neat solution. You send the Greeks from Anatolia to Greece, as it existed on the map, and the Muslim population identified as Turks to Turkey. But certain aspects of this, when you delve into the details, are critical. This would be a forcible transfer of populations. It wasn't optional if you wanted to be exchanged. You were going to be exchanged whether or not you wanted to be. So you might come from a nice port city in Anatolia and suddenly find you're going to be moved to a mountainous area in the middle of Greece. This wasn't necessarily something people were going to be familiar with. But the intention was to resolve the issue of minority rights between these two new successor states in the way of the Ottoman Empire. Greece sort of emerging from the war theoretically as one of the victor states, but having just suffered a defeat at the hands of the new Turkey and the new Turkey. This solution of an exchange of populations, a forcible exchange of populations, had never previously been attempted. And the solution led then and still continues to raise issues of what we now refer to as human rights. And we were just hearing, you uproot long-established populations shifted to lands they're unfamiliar with. But not unlike many previous humanitarian crises that had arisen unexpectedly, because most crises are unexpected. In the course of the war, this one was negotiated. And it was implemented in this instance by the international community, not by victor states or the direct participants of the states involved. So the question here for somebody who does diplomacy is, okay, you've got this idea, how do you make it work? What's the mechanism? Always look for what's the mechanism in an agreement. And in this case, the great powers at Lausanne, having come up with this idea, and I'm going to go back a little bit into this as how they came up to it, had to look for somebody that could actually implement this idea, and they came up with the person to do it. And that was a Norwegian Arctic explorer, Fridtjof Nansen. You might think that an Arctic explorer solving problems in the Eastern Mediterranean might not be the obvious fit, but of course he was seen as neutral. There was no negative quality on any side to him. So his job, for which he will become internationally renowned, is to repatriate hundreds of thousands of people in this exchange. What's his experience for this? He's already been doing it. He had been repatriating the prisoners of war that at the end of World War I, both sides had lots of POWs. They had to be sent home. It's Nansen who'd been organizing it. If you think about the human dimension of this, this is a logistic masterpiece to be able to do it. So Nansen is best known today as one of the great polar explorers. And I invite you to sort of read more about him because his whole career is fascinating. But he's also one of the most effective diplomats of this era. He was one of the diplomats of the nascent Norwegian kingdom. And just to remind you a bit of history here, Norway only became a fully sovereign state in 1906. So it's a new country. And by the way, the king of the new country, Haakon, was the nephew of the king that had been chosen by the great powers to go to Greece in the 1860s, George I. So there is a family connection there as well. But Nansen has international prominence because of his accomplishments, both as an explorer, an Arctic pioneer, and the exchange of the POWs. So he's got international respect. One of the things he comes up with is a solution to how do you move people about? You need passports. Any of you who've crossed a border, anybody, by the way, who talks about global citizenship has never tried to cross a border saying, I'm a global citizen. You've all had the experience of passport control. What do you do if you don't have a passport? So Nansen thought of a solution. He said, the new League of Nations can issue passports, and you'll be able to travel with that, and the new members of the League of Nations will have to accept the passport. And they become nicknamed Nansen passports. And they were in use by many people up into the 1970s who still couldn't find another passport to use. In the end, about 500,000 such Nansen passports were issued. Again, if you think of the logistics of doing that, how amazing it is. And by the way, those of you who want to read more about this, there was wonderful work done by a historian, New York, a Greek background, Harry Simides, who studied this in great depth, and I just pay credit to his work here. The two key figures in the story I'm talking about today are Nansen and also a Greek politician, Eleftherios Venizelos. I've lost track. I can never count how many times he was prime minister of Greece, but he comes and goes with some regularity. He's on the outs at this moment. He sort of lost an election after various upheavals in Greece in 1920, but he's back again because the Greek government turns to him as their most skilled international negotiator to represent them at Lausanne. And he's the one who, working together with the Turkish representatives, agrees the exchange of populations. Venizelos will reemerge in the 1920s as the key figure in Greek political life. He's also well respected by the Allies, and they're willing to listen to his solutions. Now, the story has many, many facets to it, but some have enduring significance, and that's where I want to sort of focus a bit in the few moments I have here. Nansen gets into this job because he has an official title from the Allies during the war that eventually becomes a League of Nations title. Once the League of Nations is established, he is in charge of dealing with refugees from Russia that are hemorrhaging out of Russia because of the Russian Revolution, from Ukraine. And where do you flee from if you're in Russia and Ukraine and escaping the revolution? You flee across the Black Sea to Constantinople, to Istanbul, which is flooded with Russian refugees. I'm going to use the term Russian loosely here for people coming from what had been the Russian Empire. So his job initially is to deal with this flood of refugees, which is how he gets into the POW business later on, and then into dealing with the Lausanne settlement on refugees. The Greek refugee crisis is going to become critical with the events of 1922, with the tragedy of Smyrna and the survivors of Smyrna, Greek and Armenian, fleeing the city and what to do with them. And Nansen's up in Constantinople already with a machinery for dealing with refugees. And so he gets involved in trying to rescue those who can, and he raises their plight with the international community. And he begins to try to find ways to get them assistance. What he develops in this period still survives today. It's the United Nations Commission High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR. And it's probably the most important large-scale refugee organization in the world. The decision to adopt the solution of the exchange of populations happened inside the context of the immediate humanitarian crisis. And historians will always argue with you, context is important for understanding, rough as the decision was, why did you come to it? There's an immediate crisis that needs resolution. And so Venizelos and Nansen work together in the context of the Lausanne negotiations to find how do you actually make this work. About 180,000 Greeks are sent to the Greek state. About 355,000 Muslims are sent to Turkey. That doesn't take into account those that had already fled, which accounts for many of the Greeks that make up that 25% that Professor Ureneck mentions now enter the Greek state. There's a footnote in this to keep, for various reasons, populations in place. A small Greek population is allowed to remain in Constantinople, and in return, a small population of Muslims in Thrace, which is how those populations continue into the later era. Nansen and his organization play a major role in the care and transportation of the displaced populations. You're going to displace populations, you physically got to move them. He's moving them by ship across the Aegean. The high politics might have settled the problem of exchanging populations. The devil's in the detail, and it's Nansen who's got to come up with the detail. This is the beginning of international refugee care and what you do about that. By early 1922, Nansen's already beginning to organize this. And as Professor Ureneck also mentioned, moving people is expensive. And what are you going to do once they arrive somewhere? And so he starts pushing right away for a loan to the Greek government to help them facilitate this huge influx of people into Greece. This is the beginning of a certain form of international humanitarian aid beginning. And I think it's largely because of Nansen's own diplomatic efforts that in 1924, the international community provides a loan to Greece to try to deal with this huge influx of people. It still has serious consequences for Greek political life. I'd be happy to talk about afterwards. Nansen, by the way, also continued to be involved in affairs of the region. He also helped Greece in a crisis in 1923 in the midst of all of this, when Italy decided to take advantage of Greece and seize the island of Corfu, and he helps actually get the Italians out of Corfu. That's another story one can just touch on about Nansen. He remains very involved. As the work of refugee settlement began to become effective, Nansen did turn his attention to other areas. Just to give you a sense of Nansen's intellectual world, he began campaigning against slavery where it still existed in the world. And he also began to be very active in the idea of international arms control, reducing the amount of weaponry out there that can lead to future turmoil and death. He also, by the way, took an interest in the plight of the Armenian refugees from the former Ottoman Empire, and he did much to try to help them through the auspices of the League of Nations, but also outside it. In 1922, Nansen's work was recognized by the award of the Nobel Prize for Peace. He donated all of the prize money to international relief work in Greece, Armenia, and Russia. In 1954, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees established the Nansen Medal for extraordinary and dedicated service to refugees. This is the highest award you can get for helping refugees in the world. Mentioned in 2016, the recipient of the Nansen Medal was the Hellenic Rescue Team for their work dealing with the most recent migration refugee crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean. And just a note at the very end, in October 2011, to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Nansen's birth, a bust of him was unveiled in Athens.
Well, I think this is the what are the three great presentations, and this is the time that we sort of like ask the questions and have a discussion on three presentations that really, in some ways, the historical presentations, but the parallels are without a doubt of what we're living through today. And I think it was the comments as far as it's not just the establishment of the Turkish state today, Turkey, still like looking for that identity, I guess, but it also establishes the Greek state in some ways. When we talk about the modern configuration of Greece, what we see today is sort of like unique. Never in history have we had this kind of a geographic configuration as we have, primarily established after Lausanne, but really finished after 1947 and after the second World War. I have a lot of questions, but I don't know if there are questions out in the audience, or like people questions of our three panelists. Yeah, Brooke.
Yeah, so I think like all of the talks touched on like the topic of like the forced exchange of populations. I guess my question would be like in terms of how that happened, and that being like the first kind of recorded event of that happening in history. Do you think that, seeing the events that happened in the next like 10, 20 years with, World War II and all of these things, do you think that that kind of not like set up the game plan, but in a way kind of like made paved the path for kind of those ideas to take shape?
There were a number of other ideas about exchange of populations, and this often comes up in conflict resolution discussions. Maybe the solution is to exchange populations. And then you go back and say, so how did this work the first time it was tried on a big scale? And it was fairly unpleasant for those involved. And I think that's always caused a hesitation to have a forcible exchange of populations. It's different to facilitate a voluntary exchange of populations, but it's the forcible nature here. But I will say aside, this is the problem of the humanitarian side and the high politics. So what follows on this, and it's partly some of the political figures involved, Ataturk and Venizelos that I was mentioning, who are key figures throughout the next 20 years. Greece and Turkey actually have fairly good relations. They at least have calm relations from the exchange of populations until about 1950, maybe you can argue into 1960. They don't have any points of conflict. The things that you think about today as Greek-Turkish conflict sort of disappear for a while, and the various reasons they reemerge. But it did sort of remove one source of tension in this period. And I think people look at that when they're looking for solutions, but it does have a downside. And it had a big social downside for Greece particularly, I think.
If I could add to that, when we talk about the forced exchange of populations, there's really, we have to separate two groups. What Eric described beautifully and accurately with all of his authority is sort of the organized exchange, right? Under the Nansen regime and all of that. And I think the numbers you mentioned probably total in what, 300,000 or 400,000, something like that. Before that occurred, more than 1 million people were forced out of Asia Minor in a disorganized way, in the sense that they were running for their lives, okay? And all along the Aegean Sea coast, the Black Sea coast, and so forth, with the victory of the Turkish nationalists, the Greeks were looking for ways to save their lives, and the Armenians, and to get out of Asia Minor. Some of them got in small boats, some of them bought passage to Greece or wherever. Many of them were rescued by the US Navy. And this is a really great story that very few Americans know. There was an American Methodist minister and a naval commander from Kentucky. His name was Halsey Powell. And these two guys together, sort of outside the lines of authority, organized an incredible maritime evacuation, beginning at Smyrna. They took 250,000 people out of Smyrna and brought them to Lesbos. And then many hundreds of thousands of other people along the Aegean Sea coast and the Black Sea coast to various Greek islands, Piraeus and Salonika. And there was suffering with all of this in both the organized and the disorganized parts of it. But there was especially suffering in the disorganized, sort of ad hoc, I'm running for my life aspect of the exchange.
And I just want to add, one of the things I learned about in the book and that I enjoyed from Professor Ureneck's research was discovering this story about the American rescue. I'm hoping somebody could make it into a film because it would make a great story. It's a real thriller what happened.
Professor, there's a movie recently, a Greek movie, portrayed that the ships of the great power were outside the port of Smyrna and watching the refugees. That was instructions not to intervene, not to take people. Have you heard that? Have you?
Yeah, and that's correct. The Italians, the British, the French, and the Americans eventually were all there in Smyrna. Smyrna was this big, rich, beautiful city. It was maybe the richest city in the Ottoman Empire in terms of, you know, like on a per capita basis. And I mean, it was an amazing place. But anyway, it was loaded with refugees and residents and so forth. And the Turkish army set the city on fire, you know, the destruction of the city of Smyrna. And it was hoped by the refugees and others that they would be taken aboard these Allied vessels and US ships. It didn't happen.
What?
Well, for several reasons. One, and I'm not defending it for sure, but because it was cruel and many, many people died and so forth. In the case of the British were very close to going to war with Turkey at that point. And they were concerned about how they were going to fight a war in the Turkish Straits, you know, at the Dardanelles. So there was a reluctance on the part of the British to kind of repurpose their mission at Smyrna to become a rescue mission. Now, they did actually save maybe 3,000 or 4,000 people. At one point, the Turkish army was setting fire to people with kerosene. And the Turkish, the British officers saw this and they were so overcome that they persuaded their officer who was leading the Mediterranean fleet, who happened to be there, to actually put boats over and save some people. So that accounts for the British. The Italians and the French, they took out their nationals, so-called. They're people who had some affiliation with Italy and France, And that's as far as they were willing to go. And the Americans didn't want to get involved either. I would have to say on the part of the Allies and the Americans, it was viewed as a kind of internal problem. These people were Ottoman citizens, well, Ottoman subjects, let me call them that. They were Ottoman subjects. There was a kind of civil war and there was disorder. And so the great powers said, and, you know, including the US, we're not going to get involved in this. And the result was much death. And it wasn't really until these two men that I mentioned, Powell and Jennings, sort of operating outside of orders and so forth, began to make a rescue. But you're absolutely right. People tried to board ships and they couldn't get on. And there was a lot of death in the city as a consequence.
So we were just talking about like, you know, the stateless people. It's actually perfect. We were discussing that today with the majority of the students on this side, who are actually in our class. And just in terms of, you said.
Not in my class. In another class.
But actually Professor Martin, but in terms of like getting, well, not necessarily getting rid of, but the program for like the UN running like their own passports, like the fact that that's no longer in effect. I mean, I'd love to know more about like why, and I guess what your thoughts are on like how that program could help or potentially harm now, especially considering like what's been happening recently this past week with Sudan and just the amount of stateless people that we currently have.
I think the Nansen passports were a great idea because they were a useful bureaucratic solution. Passports had only really become something that you needed to use just before the First World War. Before the First World War, before 1900, you asked, even if you're an American traveling abroad, you could just travel anywhere you wanted, more or less. But you'd ask for a passport because the language of the passport said, anybody who sees this confirms this is an American citizen, and we request that you help them. So it was sort of a letter of introduction almost for travel. But increasingly, as countries wanted to handle the issue of movement of populations, passport controls began to become more common. So about 20 years before the First World War, the passports really came in as something you needed to have. And that's why it sort of locked in after World War I with the creation of all these new states. And it wasn't very clear who belonged in which state with all these new borders going on. And so there were all sorts of passport issues and nationality issues going on. And it was in such a flux that you had to come up with a travel document. And it's Nansen who basically is providing a travel document so you can cross a border. I think it's still something that would be a useful solution today because you want to document who somebody is, be able to track them, but you don't want to get involved with the huge complications of, is this a citizen of this country? That's for that country to deal with. But the ability to get to a safe harbor, to be safe somewhere would be useful. So you don't actually have to tie the passport, the travel document, to establishing citizenship and nationality.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. I follow up on Brooke's question. A lot of stories and memoirs I've read of people fleeing, especially fascism and Nazism, they're often saved by a Nansen document. It is the point of a Nansen document that, unlike a passport, you don't get verified as a citizen of a certain place. You get a kind of, you're a human who's being allowed to go.
And therefore you're not.
It's kind of like for stateless person, right?
It is for a stateless person, and therefore you're not an enemy alien when you're crossing the border. So, you might be, from the country X that's in conflict with other countries. If you're a stateless person, then you're not tied to that country for purposes of at least traveling and sorting out who you are later on. I think it's one of the ideas that the UNHCR still tinkers with, but you've got to get the international community to accept it. And that's why I think Nansen is such an interesting figure, because he came up with the idea. I could talk a little bit about the intellectual history of how he thought of it, but he did understand bureaucratically how to solve a problem. And I think that's where the real interest in the mechanics of diplomacy is you've got a problem, can you solve it? And you solve it at a low level, usually, not at a high level. So looking for the simple solution was there. But it's a good point. I mean, it is an issue worth pursuing today, is how do you deal with concept of statelessness. Technically, you can't be stateless, but in fact, in reality, it exists.
I mean, one of the problems today is though, you know, you're dealing with the whole idea of, you know, there's like this paradox that exists about your ability to live anywhere you want on this earth. And at the same time, the state sovereignty argument and the walled mentality that we have today is and the ability of the state to exercise sovereignty in the ways that we can today, that really make it an impossibility as a policy. It's you know, like the students are hearing this, and it just appears to be from another world, not only from another time, but from another world. So it's very, very difficult, I think, to even like, you know, introduce that kind of a concept today when you have all these people just like waiting at borders in Turkey today, in Libya, and, you know, right off the border of the United States, right? So I don't know how feasible that is as an idea today.
And that was therefore the idea of Nansen of controlling who they would actually issue the passports to, were genuinely people who were displaced and stateless, rather than people who were simply wanting to be, I've phrased it in the economic migrants, rather than people fleeing, as we were just hearing about in both instances of fleeing for their lives. Different situation.
Well, yeah, let me switch it up. Is there a follow-up? Yeah, Burke, go ahead.
I guess just like what you said, because we were also talking about like, you know, the effect that like having a stable job, being able to have that, like that can have on your life. And so, I mean, obviously, yeah, it's not in the same context of like, you know, your life is being threatened, but like at the same time, that's why it's like kind of such a tricky issue, just in terms of like how that can actually be pursued. So like, do you think that there's like an effective solution that could like be done to differentiate, other than like between, you know, economic migrants and people who are fleeing humanitarian crises, in terms of like getting them in, that would be like actually effective? Might be a little bit too broad, but.
I think that's one where you need to get the international diplomats together to try to come up with a solution to that. I can't do it on the top of my head here, but it's one of those things that actually should be discussed and debated. I mean, partly, I mean, one of the ideas of the European Union for free movement of labor was to try to open up the movement of labor without changing nationality. So you know, you remain a citizen of Bulgaria, but you can work in France. You know, in the US, you have free movement of labor, but everybody's a US citizen in a sense within the country, or legally resident. They're tied to the US. So the EU tried to evolve a slightly different solution to that, which I think might be a glimmer of where you might look for that solution. It doesn't have to involve both the rights and obligations of citizenship in a country.
You know, I'm no expert in this area, so let me just sort of think this out loud. You know, in a sense, there are many mechanisms for people moving between and among countries now for all sorts of reasons. People from Mexico coming to the US and from Cuba coming, you know, all of that we see. I think part of the new development is that the system is overwhelmed. You know, for a variety of reasons. Economic deprivation in Cuba, violence in South America, famine in Africa. It's for these reasons that the systems that are in place are challenged and unable to deal with the numbers of people. Or, you know, we live in an era of migration. This is, you know, if you sort of bring the camera back, what's happening right now in the world? What's the big story? It's people moving around the globe to be safe and to be fed. And our systems don't seem adequate, at least, you know, in terms of staffing and maybe even conceptually, to deal with those numbers.
I agree. It sort of makes the scale of what one was dealing with after World War I look small. And
Right.
that was a tidal wave of human displacement. And I mean, just because we were touching on World War II afterwards, that was another tidal wave of good DP camps, displaced person camps in that period. And those were just the survivors of what had happened in the war. That's a more difficult problem to solve in that instance.
I'm going to ask I'll come back to you, but I want to ask a controversial question. years later, because, personal anecdote, my grandparents left Makri, which is where Fetihe is today, 10 years, Fetihe from Makri, across from Rhodes, 10 years before, as they were the forced conscription to the units of hard labor. So my hard question has to do on a personal level, and 100 years later, when we're looking at this, and we know the misery and the suffering that happened, was Lausanne effective in creating homogeneous nation states that provided for a peaceful existence? Where if Lausanne was not, if we didn't have the movement of population, we might have situations of continuous expulsions, as we saw from the modern Turkish state throughout. You spoke of the population in Constantinople, Istanbul went from a couple 100,000 people to 2,000 today. So if we hadn't done that in Lausanne, it might have been a prolonged disaster.
Do you mean, was it effective for Greece and Turkey, or do you mean was it effective as a kind of a norm? Because it seems like it wasn't the originary point of the norm, but it was part of it, and it was something that accelerated.
In creating a homogeneous nation state, I mean, one of the things about Venizelos, for instance, who was actually prime minister 8 times, I think, if my Greek history is up to snuff. One of the things that he was able to get was like Crete on this side, whereas like Kemal lost Thessaloniki, which was his birthplace. And, he sort of Venizelos got a lot of, he was primarily responsible for it, but the refugees loved him. He won elections on the refugees. And then in 1930, he's the one who effectively, when it comes to reparations, even though the Turkish state was now asking for reparations from Greece, although the property was a huge issue, and only Venizelos solves that issue in Greece. I think a lot of people give him credit for 1923 because he's brought back into a disaster and like the monkey bite and all that other stuff in Greek history.
In a sense, there's a practical answer, and I think an idealistic answer to your question. I mean, the idealistic answer is what we have in the United States. We don't want a homogeneous nation, right? I mean, out of many, one, right? Where, homogeneity is that what we're striving for? Now, so that's the sort of the idealistic response, right? We accept everyone and we integrate people in whatever they want into this society. They obey the laws and so forth. The practical response, though, is in somewhere like the Ottoman Empire, the Christians were second-class citizens. I mean, and there was no real attempt, and probably would never be, I don't know, to elevate them to the status of others who were, Muslims. I don't know. So maybe given the intolerance that existed in Turkey at that time, maybe Lausanne was the only answer.
Yeah.
I'll also just throw in on that, because this concept of nation state, which we always sort of hear this word of, if you really get down into the weeds on it, I'm not convinced anything other than many states are nation states. They have to have a small enough population. Iceland's probably a nation state, 250,000 people, they are connected. But you have, and there's no English word for this, interestingly enough. There's a good German word, Staatsvolk, the people of the state. So you have France, which has this actually multi-ethnic identity, strong regional identities. It's always had it. But there is this concept of a French identity that's established, which is supposed to be shared. You have this in sort of every country. I mean, Russia has done it. I mean, this is one of the things they want, a Russian identity, even in a very multi-ethnic state that it is. So I think that's one of those sort of interesting ideas. The US and countries like that, I think, are interesting because they got to start from afresh. And this is actually one of the interesting things about the US. It was a radical departure in how you thought about the state. It also, remember, also thought about not having a king, well, that was also a radical departure, because the king represented the Staatsvolk, whereas in the US, you could change who the leader was, and therefore all groups could be represented.
Well, that has to do with the question that we had before, and the question to the panel. Does the civilized or the people that live in countries that have higher standards responsibility to support and encourage the people in the countries with lower standards to come up? And do we have responsibility to help them? So we will not have this, as you said before, the system get clouded with people trying to move in from underdeveloped countries.
Eric is probably better at answering this question than I am, but I would say that there are some of those structures in place. I mean, the United States is endeavoring to establish trade agreements that create businesses in Mexico, Central America, and so forth, to kind of raise up the standard of living in these places. But it doesn't seem to be enough. You know, we're talking not just about creating jobs. You know, we in America, we're very practical. We think about creating jobs. You build a factory, there are jobs. But, you know, you go to these provinces in Mexico, I mean, there are drug gangs, the corruption is everywhere. People fear for their lives and so forth. So it's not just a question, I think, of money and jobs. It's a question of, you know, how do nations evolve? How do cultures evolve so that they grow and prosper? I don't know the answer to that, but Eric, you want to take a shot at that?
Does the people that are better off have the responsibility to help the other people? You said before that.
I think they do. I
Does
think,
Americans have the responsibility to build jobs in Mexico? Why
that's an
American?
ethical question, and I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. I would say yes, for two reasons. One, it seems like the right thing to do. I go to church, this is what the minister tells me, you know, love thy neighbor. So there's that. The other thing is, it's in our benefit, right? We're dealing with this cascade of people coming over the border. We don't know who they are. We don't know whether they're friendly or unfriendly. We don't, you know, whether they're gang members or not. So, you know, we want to deal with this refugee crisis. And so in any way that we can, if we help in these other places, it will help us as well. So it seems to me to both be the right thing and the practical thing.
And I'd add into that, you know, people in foreign policy analysis often talk about what's in the national interest. And ultimately what the purpose of a government is, you could argue, is to provide security for the country, to protect it. So how do you protect the country? What's in the national interest? And Franklin Roosevelt summed it up very well in one of his famous fireside chats. If your neighbor's house is on fire, wouldn't it be wise to lend him your garden hose to put the fire out? So, you know, if your neighbor's economy is on fire, you know, the fire can reach you. Maybe it helps to lend him the garden hose. So aid to neighbors can both be virtuous, but it can also be in the national interest to do so. That's the way I think it gets effectively accepted by some political groups, because in the end, in a democratic state, you have to get everybody feeling there's a vested interest in it. The other thing, and touching on a point that Lou just raised, I think you can also divide the world between countries where there's the rule of law and where there isn't the rule of law, and where you can do business and where you can't do business as one consequence, much less questions of human rights. And I think that's an interesting way to sort of see how you can divide the world. And the countries where the rule of law is don't color in a large part of the map of the world.
I also think that, look, if you're talking about thinking a few steps ahead to prevent a major war or major, you know, economic collapse that would bring a flood of refugees to richer parts of the world, more privileged or more successful countries should make efforts to deal with crises before they become overwhelming. Yes, they probably should, and it would be, as both these panelists have been saying, in our best interest, but we don't even do that domestically. People don't do it regionally, they don't do it domestically, and they don't do it internationally. So, I mean sometimes, but overall, that's my feeling.
we have the example in Europe where people from sub-Sahara and African countries, with the help of Turkish Airlines, they fly from their countries to Ankara, and from there with flights go to Europe, and they ask for help, even though the reason for going there was for better life. Is that the right to ask for it? If I am born in Sudan, do I have the right to go to Germany and say, accept me because I don't live well in my country and you live better, and let me share your wealth? I don't know.
That there's no, but budget, each country, each state has a budget, you know, how do you figure it's overwhelming, you have so many people coming, all coming from New York, they're coming here, better land, more education and medical, and all that stuff, it's like overwhelming, it's too many people moving here, I noticed from New York, New Jersey, it's like.
I think there are a couple of different conversations here.
Yeah.
One conversation has to do with, like, you know, to bring it back to the Treaty of Lausanne and post-Treaty of Lausanne. I think you have a conversation where you have like fragmented societies.
Yeah.
So one of the things about the Treaty of Lausanne, for instance, what it did to Greece, when you talk about the expansion of the population, it created, you know, an issue as far as identity is concerned, and as far as being absorbed in the local economy, in the local community, and the social and the cultural structure. So a lot of the people that came over from Asia Minor, they were derogatorily looked as Turkish seed. They were not fully Greek. They were not fully Hellenes. So they had to be adjusted into the system. So you saw a lot of crime. You saw a great deal of poverty. You saw a great deal of inability to be absorbed. A lot of those people continued on their trek and found homes in Germany, in Belgium, in the United States, in the Congo. They worked the mines, they did all kinds of jobs to be absorbed. So this issue of like traveling that we are observing today is nothing new. And the sharing of the wealth is not necessarily new. It's something that has happened. It's transitory. And I think that's what the point earlier with, you know, Eric, as far as the passports for stateless people, it's very, very difficult today to do because the conception has completely changed. You can't conceptualize a world where that freedom of movement is possible, right? And although it's embedded in the Declaration of Human Rights, we have the right to live anywhere we want on the planet. That's a right. That's a human right. At the same time, you have a sovereign space, and states say, I determine who comes into my country and who doesn't come into my country. And the absorption is not just an issue of moving people around. There's an issue of like fragmentation. And Eric spoke of like the rule of law. It's very difficult to consent to the rule of law when you don't see the law of you, for you. And the law becomes a coercive mechanism in order for you to abide, whether it's foreigners or we see it in American inner cities. I mean, we see this inability to absorb the society. So that's what I was saying about Lausanne earlier, whether it was a success or not. Yes, it was a painful transition, and I can go back to the anecdotal evidence. And for my grandmother, it didn't really mean anything. She could have her cup of coffee and call it Turkish coffee. For my father, who was born in Greece, the coffee was Greek coffee. My grandmother, who left when she was 9, she had no conception of this national identity in that way, where my father was completely different. So you go from refugee to immigrant in some ways, like in my own personal story. And I think that's the point of like Lausanne too. It's a point of like transformation and movement of population in ways that we haven't seen before.
But, in fairness to this gentleman's perspective, the human right of freedom of movement, it also runs up against the realities of governance. I mean, every nation has limited resources, right? It takes money to resettle people. There's finite land, finite housing. We want a commitment to the law and so forth. So it seems to me that there are arguments on both sides, and we look for wise people to make wise laws to sort of adjudicate who comes in and who doesn't. What I'm trying to say is I sympathize at some level with what you're saying. It's an issue of governance.
Agree. Yeah, Marty.
Well, if the Treaty of Lausanne was like the start of like mass migration, so to say, so to speak, and like the codification of mass migration, then I would think that like in the United States, 9/11 is like the antithesis of that, right? Like nobody could move that day. No one could cross borders. And in a post 9/11 world where people would rather put up walls than allow for people to cross over borders, do you think that there will be a return to more of this less state sovereignty and more international unity? Do you see that?
The one comment I will make is there are a lot of wonderful tourist sites around the world that are walls that were built to try to stop migrations, and they don't work. Walls basically don't work. So that's the historian's perspective. But then people who propose walls don't study the history. So that's you need to deal with migration in other ways.
But the impulse to safety, I mean, this is a great way to sort of frame the question. In a sense, it's an impulse to safety, right? And I think it seems to me that is a trend, sort of fear of what happens, fear and an impulse towards safety. Now, how that plays out in wise policy, I don't know. But I think you put your finger on sort of kind of an important psychological aspect of what underlies the immigration debate.
You mentioned 9/11, it also, I thought of that when Professor Goldstein was talking about the Nansen document, because I thought, but post 9/11 and international terrorism, how would terrorists use Nansen documents? I mean, I know it's a very small point, but the idea of a document that was more open than a passport and more functional for people in difficult situations is great, but I also think I could see how it could be exploited, possibly more easily than a passport, but I could be wrong.
Luke, I guess you have the last question.
Oh, it's not really a question, more a comment. Just building off Marty's point, I think like that is one of the issues that we see like with the refugee conflict in Europe today. Like I think many states within the European Union probably do have the resources or the capability to accept these refugees, but it's more the cultural aspects and the cultural changes that these refugees would bring to the country that kind of deters the states. And I think, one state in particular that like brings to my mind is the Hungarian example of they don't want to accept these refugees just because they don't look or believe the same things that they do. And I think that goes to Marty's point that after 9/11, I think there was kind of a connotation that went along with people based on their religion or based on the way that they look. And I think that deters developed states from really welcoming them in and kind of readjusting the way that their country kind of looks.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, Molly, you had a question? Well, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the panelists, first of all, Professor Ureneck, Professor Murphy, Professor Goldstein, for giving us a lot of food for thought, certainly a historical perspective on what happened 100 years ago. I promise we'll continue the conversation next semester. We'll look at, again, we'll put a panel together for Lausanne, maybe more of a political perspective. But you're also seeing the parallels of today. And I think one of the points I want to echo Professor Ureneck's point, how a lot of times, we might have good intentions, but we don't necessarily have the attention span to see those good intentions through. And, I've made it a point in my class, just seeing those people just hanging off the plane in Afghanistan on the 15th of August of 2021 should be a reminder for all of us. In the same way that people were waiting in Smyrna to be taken. So we just repeat history if we don't necessarily know it. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank everybody here for supporting the program one more year. So thank you very much.